As far as I'm concerned, as long as that same respect and recognition is not shown toward every one of our people in this country, it doesn't exist for me. And during the few moments that we have left, we want to have just an off-the-cuff chat between you and me. Us. We want to talk right down to earth in a language that everybody here can easily understand.
Welcome back to another episode of The Malcolm Effect, and today I am honoring you all with someone who is a teacher to me, someone who has challenged me in ways I had not expected, and I'm learning so much from. Welcome, Professor Grovogui, to The Malcolm Effect. How are you?
I am fine. Thank you for inviting me.
It's an honor and privilege to have you here. So today I want to speak about the legacy of Sekou Toure and why I felt it necessary and important to do so. Online in the Twitter space and Twitter sphere, there seems to be a painting or rendering of the legacy of Sekou Toure, which seems unfamiliar to what I have come to know of the man and read of him. People calling him a tyrant, a dictator, a despot, and I haven't found a balanced take on online in many places. So I want to kind of, take a balanced approach to the legacy and to the man. So first and foremost, do you mind sketching out for our listeners what Guinea was like in the lead up to independence?
Well, Guinea historically had two major political groups in the Fouta Jalon in the savannah. We had a theocratic state formation in the Fouta Jalon with 9 provinces and etc. And then we had a very centralized state structure in the savannah, which is sort of many centuries of transmutations from the result of many centuries of transmutations from the Mali Empire to the Wasulu to Samori Toure. And then we have on the coast and in the rainforest groups of people who were so-called stateless, acephalous societies. And colonialism or colonial authorities played a lot on those differences. And in many ways, for schooling, for instance, did not favor people, say, in the rainforest, who were the last to go to school. And in some ways, because the resistance of Samuel Toure to colonial rule was the longest of in all of French colonial history, 17 years, the colonial power favored the Fouta Jalon, aided by the fact that it was more conservative, but also the fact that in their own colonial topology had thought that those people had much longer tradition of schooling and etc., and therefore would be natural leaders or at least intermediaries to colonial power. And basically, the struggle for decolonization operated, that's the structures within which the struggle for independence happened. And different leaders tried to use instruments from those, in those contexts to gain power. And Sekou Toure, the man we are talking about today, actually defied both the orthodoxies, political orthodoxies of colonial powers in the Fouta in the savannah, and decided to opt for support from labor unions and market women, and then managed to supplant all of the political leaders and institutions that were grounded in the old sort of old formations of Fouta Jalon theocracy or the Malenke centralized state structures, which were all more conservative. And of course, the World War II and what happened after World War II in the French Empire seemed to favor sort of a breaking off from those structures and having a more progressive movement, which is what Sekou Toure did.
Thank you so much for laying that historical context for us. So then now let's speak a bit about Sekou Toure's actual rise to power. If you mind sketching the picture out for that, how it took place, when did Guinea gain independence, and what was the scenes like?
Sekou Toure came to power on the back of a labor strike, and that labor strike has been documented in Ousmane Sambéne's God's Beasts of Wood, which shows that in French West Africa, labor unions, the railroad that sort of took our products out to the sea to go to Europe and etc., the workers had a strike in 1947 throughout the entire empire. The strike lasted in Guinea longer than it did in any of the other countries, in part because Sekou Toure found a formula. The way the French broke the strike was to close down the print media, radio, and then public gatherings to prohibit public gatherings. Sekou Toure went to market women, who of course had to sell, therefore were able to move around, didn't have major newspapers to be banned, to be shut down, and relied on market women to pass the message of the party. And market women also helped feed the strikers in Guinea And so the strike lasted in Guinea more than any other part of West Africa. And that's actually what gave Sekou his power. Initially, actually, people derided his political coalition by calling them mostly a party of high school dropouts. Yet the strikers were not educated or postal workers, etc. So they called them high school dropouts, divorced women, and prostitutes, marking the market women who supported his political party. But it actually turned out to be the magic formula because the French could not find their way to stamp out his political movement. Since it operated in a more informal structure from the state structures, the formal media, this and that, and yeah. So that's how he managed to do that.
Okay, so Sekou Toure comes to power.
Yeah,
Guinea achieves independence. So carry on, yes?
yes. Sekou comes to power. So the forces that made him succeed were far more radical and far more progressive, and they pushed him against his will. Actually, that's documented. Initially, he did not want to vote no on the referendum in '58, but the workers who backed him and the women pushed him having toward defying the goal. And the Sekou Toure's power was born as a sin against French grandeur. That de Gaulle himself came in August '58 in Guinea to plead for the French Union, and Sekou Toure defied him. And that was unacceptable on the part of French, the Americans, and all of Western powers. Because de Gaulle obviously was one this larger than life character, and this young labor unionist who didn't even have a high school education, confronted him with one of the most radical speeches about republicanism and freedom and etc. etc. And they thought he humiliated him. And in fact, the sign of that humiliation is that the only time de Gaulle left any scene forgetting his hat, his very familiar hat, was in Guinea after that speech. He forgot it. They had to take it back to the airplane. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So,
So
so,
we
so
see, yes.
yeah. No, go ahead, please.
No, so we see, okay, this is the scene in which Sekou Toure has come to power. He emerges in a time of, he's emerging from amongst or within the contradictions of the colonial yoke, of the French colonial yoke. So speaking about in the early stages of his governance, what was his priorities for Guinea and what was his priorities for the continent?
Yes. Guinea, the Secretary came to power as a Pan-Africanist. He immediately joined Kwame Nkrumah. Ghana had been independent in '57 and Guinea in '58, so they were close together. And of course, later they would form the Guinea-Ghana-Mali Union. And so he was very Pan-Africanist, and he came back committed to freeing Africa, the two of them. So in the Congo crisis, you will see Sekou Toure's support for Patrice Lumumba. Sekou Toure was one of the earliest supporters of the Algerian independence movement. Sekou Toure contributes to the decolonization movement throughout the Portuguese Empire. I mean, in that regard, his record is unimpeachable. He probably was one of the most committed Pan-Africanists ever on that continent. No, there's no independence movement on the continent in Africa that did not receive help from Guinea. That is actually unquestionable. In fact, in Mozambique, Sekou Toure went as far as lend teachers to Mozambique. Sekou Toure sent 500 teachers to Mozambique when Mozambique became independent to go educate people because Mozambique did not have enough teachers. So that is unquestionable. But so that was the second sin of Sekou Toure. The first one was to have defied de Gaulle and sort of diminished de Gaulle's stature so publicly, of course, among black people in Africa. And forgive me, that was also one of the part of the problem. But also because, that was his first sin. The second sin was that he decided to help in the liberation of Africa and put against him the Portuguese and the French and everybody together. And of course, that's why Portugal invaded Guinea. So in the narrative about Guinea, Sekou Toure, we don't talk about the multiple assassination attempt, which people used to think were false, but has now been documented. Every single one of the plots have been documented. It's substantiated. And the invasion also was not fabricated. It was true.
Speaking about his early governance, then as well, if you don't mind just kind of speaking about his early governance, how did he rule in Guinea in the early days?
In the early days, actually, I will tell you, even until he died, Sekou Toure had majority support in Guinea. In fact, that's the thing that baffles people's mind is why that man had to have a single party system. Because he would beat his opponent every day in any election. But I think that what people who know actually Guinea know is that his two Pan-Africanist friends, Kwame Nkrumah and after Kwame Nkrumah, Modibo Keita in Mali, were both overthrown. But before then, Sylvanus Olympio was killed for his opposition to the CFA Franc. So Sekou Toure basically, the lesson he drew from that was that it will never happen to him. And I think that was actually a very fatal mistake on his part. because psychologically he became very, very obsessed with never losing to his opponent and not ending up dead like the rest of them. And so after the invasion, his power turned very nasty. But initially, we all owe public education given to Sekou Toure, infrastructure to Sekou Toure. Nobody after Sekou Toure has matched what he did. And the one thing everybody recognizes today is that of all the leaders we had after independence, he's the only one who did not take a dime from the public coffers for himself. When he died, people suspected he had money stored everywhere. He actually did none of that. Right. So in terms of personal integrity, in terms of commitment, there's actually no doubt. But the violence after 1970 is real. So we cannot paper over that.
So let's speak about that, because I feel like people tend to focus on that. People don't tend to speak on about his policies. So we can return to some of the policies and some of the good things he done. But I think people will be interested to hear what led up to the 1970s violence and what took place and why did Sekou Toure act in the way he did. And again, if you don't mind including in that on your response, how as us as Pan-Africanists looking back on this man, how should we judge him?
Well, if Pan-Africanists, and I've talked to a lot of people in a lot of multiple fora before this one, I often say the modern states, we have to be honest, the modern state system, the state machinery is a very violent instrument. And during the Cold War, on both sides, people use the state machinery to violent ends. You know, when people talk about the violence in Guinea, for instance, they don't talk about the invasion, right? And we know what any country on this planet has done after being invaded, including, after 9/11 here, which is not to condone it, actually, because I'm very fearful of that kind of state power. But we forget that the Kambwaro, where people were sent to jail in Guinea, the Kambwaro was named for a policeman who Sekou Toure's opponent threw from a helicopter and crashed down. So if you want to talk about violence, I always talk about Boiro. Boiro is a very, if you think about the name Boiro, it has those two things are there, but people don't see the other side. The other side was that Boiro was a victim of Sekou Toure's opponent who thought that those Sekou Toure has won elections organized by the French themselves, that they were entitled to overthrow Sekou Toure because they didn't like him. So Sekou Toure may have been the violent, whatever Tyron called him, whatever it is, but the Democrat and the Republican was Sekou Toure, actually. That is, we have to be smart about that, which is, again, the state system. The state is a very violent one, and people instrumentalize it, and the way in which you use it, I wouldn't want it against, right? So what has happened, why the narrative of the tyranny has settled in, and we forgot other parties, that after he died and the Kambwaro, the stories came out, everybody, including myself, had to give people whose relatives died in the Kambwaro to heal. It was a deference. But it's not that the political narrative was correct, actually. But that narrative is not the one that has taken over, because it was in the interest of France and the West to focus on Sekou Toure's, on the Kambwaro, to occult what they had tried to do to subvert independence throughout the whole continent and to crush Pan-Africanism. So it was easy for them to carry on that message. And so the media, BBC, France Inter, etc., and Sekou Toure's political opponent, who were better educated than him, because he did not even have a high school degree, who were also connected, more connected than him, managed to pass that message, and it occult what life was in Guinea like, right? And if there is a sense in any country in West Africa today, bar none actually, where there's a sense of sort of citizenship, like nationalism innate, it's in Guinea. When we had the civil wars in Mali, around Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Mali, Cote d'Ivoire, Liberia, Sierra Leone, I was invited to the State Department once to talk about why Guinea was not collapsing. I said, because you all think, you have bought into the narrative about Sekou Toure, but Guinea is actually, there's really citizenship in Guinea. Those sending young people to serve in regions other than their own, having to send students do civil service work 18 months after university in some village and etc. All of them instilled in us something, a sense of Guinea that cannot be just broken down. That is actually what even all of the refugees from Guinea-Bissau, Mali, Cote d'Ivoire, Sierra Leone, Liberia, they were all in Guinea. Guinea has the highest percentage, but the civil war did not come to Guinea. And I think that people at the State Department were initially skeptical, but over time I've had people from that meeting who call and say there is really a Guinea exception. And that's the work of Sekou Toure. I mean, he created a nation. He really did. Of course, the cost of that for people who opposed him was again very high, Kambwaro. But if you look at state violence, especially the French eliminating every African political leader who they didn't like, from Umnyobe, Mumie, Olympio. You go down the line. I mean, come on. Cold War violence was not, the real culprit were not these little African leaders. I think that the violence was programmed from somewhere, and then other people reacted to it. But the reactions are what we look at, and we don't look at the structure of the Cold War and how the West wanted to stamp out African progressivism, and they really tried to.
Absolutely. So, I mean, you speak about there being a deference to allow people's families to heal. But then when we're trying to do correctives on narratives, what should the narrative be when we think about Kamboro and Sekou Toure's and the violence that occurred under his presidency?
Well, I have a friend who tells me that the best way to start a conversation on that is to recall Shakespeare. Sorry, I know we
Okay.
are talking about Pan-Africanism.
No, it's
You know,
fine.
security, the line between security and paranoia is actually not, is very thin. Look at after post 9/11 in America, right? About Islamophobia and etc. So, state security operates in a context in which the ideology of security and paranoia can really be very close, and we really have to be mindful of that. But what we cannot do is allow people to define our own historical trajectories. That is a very dangerous thing, because then we don't know what actually happened in the course of our own lives, and we succumb to these easy judgments, right? But of the crimes committed during the Cold War, again, France, whatever, I don't think Sekou Toure is actually the worst. Uh, but and I say that with all, again, being mindful that people who lost their families, we all actually really have to attend to their feelings and etc. etc. That you cannot let that go, right? You have to respect that. But our national histories cannot be held hostage also by people with private stories, because then the national purpose get lost to people's private sentiments, and that actually is, for me, also a problem, right? But we have to pay attention to the state as an instrument of violence in our own political project, and to be mindful of what it can do, and it's not always good. The state instrument of violence is actually, monopoly of violence has a double edge, and we have to be mindful. But we also have to be mindful of our right to protect, right? That those Pan Africanists, after Olympio, Nkrumah, Modibo Keita, and etc., that the rest of them have to say, we have to survive. And if you deny that too, then you are either politically naive or you are being disingenuous. But I go back to that. Sekou Toure's conception of Africa, of Pan-Africanism, of his right to young people, to education, to giving us the means, whatever, that actually was very coherent. And you may disagree with part of it. We all have the right to quarrel with ideological how people present things. But his commitment were real. That, even today, not a single one of his opponents can actually doubt that. And they will not talk about that because it's easier to just talk about Kambwaro and not have to dissect that. But his commitment were real.
Okay. So then we can understand the commitments, we can understand the narratives. One thing I've seen in discussions then, people tend to paint out what happened in Kamboro as almost a direct attack and targeting of a specific tribe, and the tribe being the Fulani tribe. People will say Sekou Toure would like to, or he targeted the Fulani tribe for this.
Two things. The first one is empirical. There was never a point during Sekou Toure's career as president where more than a third of his cabinet was not Fulani. We talk about Fulani as if ideologically they were coherent. No, the vice president of Guinea until he died was Saifullah Jallow. He was a Peul. During the entire Congo crisis, Sekou Toure's spokesperson was Teli Jallow, who became Secretary General of the African Union, Organization of African Union, and then of course died in the Camp for sure. But to say that it was actually ethnic is actually really, really, really dangerous and disingenuous. No. The only thing for me, personally, I found objectionable in Sekou Toure's narrative was when, after 1968, he decided that the French had favored the Peul and it was his job to balance that. And so we had a version of what we call affirmative action in America, in Guinea, for other ethnic groups, because the Peul represented more than 60% of bureaucracy, of educated people, and etc. And so he latched on to examples of university students complaining that Pearl professors were favoring people of the ethnic group and in grading and etc., and decided that there was a racism Pearl. So his version of affirmative action, he called it La lutte contre le racisme Pearl, the struggle against Pearl racism against other ethnic groups, because they were, Import export is dominated by them. Public administration dominated by them. Education dominated by them. But that is as a consequence of French policy and French educational policies. So you do not reverse that by basically turning petty grievances against the Pearl, of which you had many, and saying that there was a racism in Pearl, and use that as an instrument to prevent Pearls from having fellowships. So for 5 years, he just said he was going to freeze the Pearl out and send other ethnic groups to fellowships abroad, right? That, I think, as a policy, it was actually misguided. But even then, he said there was a racism Pearl. Actually, for him, it was the opposite. The Pearl were using the structural advantage, which was the result of colonial domination of Guinea, to try to prevent not only him, to prevent him from succeeding, but also to continue the supremacy in bureaucracy, in commerce, and in public and social life, right? And so, but in that struggle, the old Amical Gilbert Vieillard, which was his biggest political organization that opposed him, was also Pearl. So two political parties, one is progressive, has a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-professional, etc., and one was anchored in traditional Pearl aristocracy, right? It was grounded in Pearl aristocracy. The name Amical Gilbert Vieillard is even is a French name they had for it because it was also closer to French agenda and etc. etc. Right? And they take that and say, because his opponents are Pearl and he's gone after them, then it's anti-Pearl. Whereas in his government, you can Google, there's no point in which where Sekou had a government where more than a third were not from the Futa Jalon. That is actually a fact, right? And so there's A exists, B exists is not actually a good logical argument. His opponents were Pearl, he was not Pearl, and therefore. That is actually no. The opposition just happened to be there, and that's how the cookie broke in Guinea after colonialism. People were educated and were close to the aristocracy were Pearl, and people were not educated were people from the forest and market women and etc. He went there to get his vote. I mean, it's right, and I often tell my friend to be very careful, to be very, very careful, because that actually can be so easily debunked. My only problem in Guinea, where I really have a problem in Guinea, is when people whose relatives went in Camboiro stand up and make certain statements. You really want to defer to their sentiment. But there's always a point where I say, okay, you've said that, I grant you that, but they don't want to go that direction because the Camboiro has also been a way of not talking about their own politics. And the fact that what Sekou Toure was saying that if the Pearl came to power, everybody shut out from commerce, education, administration, and etc. because their numbers were overwhelming in all those sectors. That actually made sense to a lot of people in Guinea. Whether the Pearl would have done that or not is actually, I actually doubt. Some of them were quite like Teddy Barry Troa. These were actually very, very people who understood nation building. They probably would not have done that. But everybody was afraid of the sheer power of the Pearl. And so he instrumentalized that. So we really have to be careful. And we are at a moment in African history where we have to take stock, right, of what happened in a very smart way. And I don't actually like, because if I have to pick the Sekou Toure and the French any day, I pick Sekou Toure. If I have to say,
absolutely.
and I've said that, if I have to say choose between Sekou Toure and his old opposition, the Futa Jalon, I still pick Sekou Toure.
Okay, no,
Even
absolutely.
Today. Even today.
Absolutely.
But
I'm in agreement with you, yes.
But again, state power is the thing we have to worry about. Emergency laws that the colonial powers left us have been used against opponents in Africa, whether it's in Guinea, in Kenya, in Zimbabwe, in etc. We have to be mindful of state power, especially the power of violence.
Absolutely. And in terms of, okay, so I want to do two things now. Let's talk about the things that you feel Sekou Toure should be praised for in terms of policy. And then maybe we can talk about the things that you feel, I remember in our class you mentioned the point of secret trials should never have taken place and things like this. So let's speak about the good and the bad.
Yeah, no,
of the man.
The good actually is so overwhelming that I no, but people, that's the irony, right? People focus on this thing because they actually can think, they cannot talk substantively about his policies because it's actually overwhelming. Education, nationhood, Pan-Africanism, support for decolonization, defend the right of black people at the United Nations, gender policy. In 1978, UNESCO said it. Guinea was the only country in Africa where the university has 50-50, 50% of women, 50% of men. It was not fabricated because education was universal. And that has been reversed today, right? In all of those regards, actually, he is unimpeachable, right? But what I'm saying actually is that, you see, the thing about, there's a dimension of the state. If we really want to be post-colonial, decolonial, however you want to, whatever you want to say that, the state as an instrument has to be decolonized. There's a certain fashion of understanding sovereign power, which we have to let go of. It does not fit us. That understanding of sovereignty is the one that said, well, in America, if you have an offense against state, like after 9/11, they have Guantanamo in the French election. Sekou could easily point to all of these and tell them, what are you telling me? He actually went to France and said, what, all of these offenses against state, you have secret trials because you don't want how intelligence was obtained, you don't want all of those. And my answer has always been, we don't have to do it that way. And so where I am today is, I can tell you for sure that there was a permanent plot against Sekou Toure. I can tell you that the invasion happened. I can tell you that they tried to murder him. But I cannot tell you for sure who is guilty because all these trials were secret. And that's what I say. So I am stuck because I understand that all of these things happened. The French have recognized it. It's no longer secret. But I don't want to, I can't tell you who was there because there was we said, get a reglement de compte, right? Scores being settled. Or who was there because they actually were part of that because all the trials were secret. And we don't have to give in that dimension of state power. And for me, that actually is the lesson. But it is not that the thing itself did not happen because that's real, right?
Yes.
But secret trials, you do that, then I don't have, I can't tell you who did what. That don't count on me
Yes.
to vouch for you. I cannot vouch for that.
Absolutely.
But I can neither vouch for the innocence of everybody because obviously they were not all innocent.
Yeah.
But I cannot tell you that every single one of them individually was guilty because I can't tell you that either.
Absolutely. In thinking about Pan Africanism today, then, and lessons we can draw from the Sekou Toure's legacy and other Pan African scholars and the continent today, what are we like? If you're talking to young Pan Africanists today, what is some advice you're going to give us?
There is something we say about that first generation of African leaders, Nyerere, Nkrumah, Modibo Keita, Sekou Toure, and etc. There was a degree of selflessness, number one. There was a degree of pride. Like they were actually proud people who did not debase themselves. They also believe in solidarity unqualifiably. Sekou Toure took in people like Miriam Makeba, etc., etc. Of course, Nkrumah came. They believed in African solidarity unquestionably, and it cost state money. It cost money to support liberation movements in Congo, in Algeria, in Angola, Mozambique, and etc., etc. It really was, it's right, but they believed in that. So they believed, they had integrity, they believed they had commitments, right? They also believed in African solidarity. I am not sure that they had, at the level of institution making, that they were equipped to carry out sometimes what they wanted to do. But the thing itself that they desired, the way that manifests itself, was actually real. And what it tells young Pan Africans is that Pan African did not collapse under its own weight. The mistake that people made on the way to Pan Africanism were not always of their own making, but that's not sufficient for us. What we have to do is to go beyond that, to recognize, to face their mistakes, and to move on without having to undercut what they were trying to do. Because those people changed the world. Nasser changed how Europe related to things that belong to us. Suez Crisis. Sekou Toure changed how we understand Sekou Toure and Nkrumah together changed how we understand self-determination in Congo. Liberia and Ethiopia, yes, under Selassie, forced the world to have to decide whether international law can stay the same, where people who were the victims of it become independent. On the question of Namibia, and over 20 years changed how people look at international law. Those people actually changed the world. We actually don't know. And so we have, young Pan Africans are chasing, go somewhere. Well, he did this. No, 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 no. They actually accomplish things. Those are the places to start. They change how the law operates. They change how global politics operates. They change how the world looked at Africans. They may not have been equipped to give us the institutions that correspond to that, to those.
And then in speaking to some of my listeners are going through the PhD process like me. In speaking to these people who are going to the next generation of African intellectuals, what's your words of advice to them?
My word of advice to them, again, it's one of those things that's almost cliche. Sometimes people like me or my friends get exasperated when old Africans say, or even young people today, think for yourself. I think we should. I don't think the disciplines that we have today, they came historically to answer certain questions. I think they answer our own questions. I don't think we should be looking ourselves through somebody else's lenses. I don't think we should necessarily just take up other people's judgment of us. And what I think the most is really to know us in the way that we don't. Pan Africanism has not just been an ideology. What happened in Haiti was Pan African, a bunch of former slaves who gave Haiti the constitution. What happened in Palmares was Pan-Africanism. Marcus Garvey's was Pan-Africanism. In time, in time, when those things happen, if you place those in time in relation to what was happening around them at that time, they were actually far more advanced than what happened in other spaces. And so to judge Haiti today, the Haitian revolution about what is happening in Haiti today is like to make a negative judgment on Western traditions because they said they are Greek and Greek is in the mess today. Greek
I
is in
love
the
that. I
mess
love
today.
that example. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
But the Greeks
And
are who gave them the traditions. So looking at the state of Haiti today, or the fact that Palmyra disappeared, or Marcus Garvey did not succeed, is not an indictment of Pan Africanism. That is the error we make. Otherwise, Rome gave Western civilization rule of law and all of that stuff. Look at Rome today; they can't even collect the garbage, right?
yes,
I mean, it's not. We have the most, you know, banal reactions. I don't know even how to describe it, right? But it's very infuriating because it's actually it's a lack of analysis. That's an analysis. One has to take Haiti for what it was when the American and the French Revolution also happened in that context. One has to look at what Marcus Garvey was proposing. When Marcus Garvey was proposing was network capitalism, Britain conquered the world by gobbling together family capital into corporations and occupying, making corporate territories that became colonies. I mean, these people actually saw something. That's what is amazing is that a lot of these people did not have the same education as other people, but they could sense something and they could see it. And so today, in every this is what I tell my young students here, in every school in America today, networking is taught in business schools. Marcus Garvey saw that in 1910, that networking will be the future of capitalism. Marcus Garvey saw that. He couldn't express it, formulate it the way we do network theory today in our business schools, but he saw that. So our trajectory is far more interesting than these quick snap judgment we make of individual people, individual episodes, and etc. can capture, and we should get out of that.
absolutely. And I guess finally, we've again because I think it's such a rich conversation. What is the role of the African intellectual today?
My friend, that's a long conversation, but I can tell you for sure that Fanon was right.
Okay.
The people, the people we talked about. Fanon actually was reflecting when he said each generation of must decide in relative obscurity, blah blah blah, and their mission, define their mission, betray it or realize it, and etc. Those are the moments where Frank Fanon left psychology and went to history. Haitians did what they could at the time of the revolution. Palma, they did what they could, right? Garvey did what he could or thought he could do. Even decolonization, those people did what they could. I think we really have to decide what have we done, and we have yet to answer that. I think Fanon was right. What have you done except self-aggrandizement? What have you done except criticize everybody for everything and never propose something concretely? What have we done? Sometimes I wonder 30 years from now, what are they going to say these intellectuals in Africa today in the past 40 years have done? What institutions have they contributed to creating? Except applaud for every coup because they want to make money. We train professors to go abroad and teach other people's children, myself included. Our athletes leave to go somewhere else and entertain other people. What have we done? I think it's a serious question, actually. And the conversation people had in Manchester during colonial rule, Africans, diaspora, they met in Manchester to talk among themselves, in Paris to talk about among themselves. When have African scholars talked together, not to say how brilliant their essay in philosophy and etc. is, but to just answer a simple question: where are we, and what's to be done?
Thank you so much. This has been an enriching conversation. People, as I said to you in the intro, this has been an honor for me, an honor for us all. I hope to have Professor Grovogui in the future again on the podcast. Please like, comment, subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Peace out.